3 days. That was all Emma Hartwell had to turn dirt into a home or freeze to death trying. She stood in the barn on the evening of October 28th, 1889, with her hands pressed flat against the rough wooden wall and her breath coming shallow in the cold Montana air. The ultimatum had been delivered over dinner served on her mother's plates by a woman who had no right to touch them. Catherine's voice had been calm, almost pleasant, as if she were discussing the weather rather than casting out the only family her husband had left. One woman per house. That was how Catherine had phrased it, her Boston accent, making the words sound refined even as they cut like a blade. Michael had said nothing. He sat at the head of the table, the place their father had occupied until influenza took him in January, and studied his plate with the focused attention of a man who desperately wished to be anywhere else. Emma had watched him, willing him to speak, to defend her, to remember the 8 months she had kept this farm running, while he courted a city woman who thought dirt was something to be scraped off rather than worked into. The silence stretched until Catherine smiled and passed the potatoes. November 1st. That was the deadline. 3 days to pack what little she owned and disappear into a world that had no use for 19-year-old women with calloused hands and no dowry. The town was 8 miles away over roads that turned to frozen mud when the temperature dropped, and the temperature was already dropping. Night air in northern Montana carried a bite in late October that promised worse to come. Emma had asked around before casually during the summer, when Catherine's visits had grown longer and Michael's attention to farm work had grown shorter. There was no work for single women. The general store had a clerk. The hotel had a cook. The schoolhouse had a teacher. Every position that might keep a woman fed and sheltered through winter was filled by someone with family connections or a husband's name to vouch for her. She could marry, of course. That was what women in her position did when the world offered no other door. Ned Parker had hinted awkwardly that his farm could use a woman's touch. He was 43 with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that lingered too long when he shook hers at church. Tom Wheeler had been more direct, cornering her after service to explain that his wife had died in childbirth and his 3 children needed a mother. He had not asked if she wanted to be that mother. He had simply stated the need and waited for her to fill it the way one might point to a broken fence and expect it to be mended. Emma had smiled and made vague promises and walked away feeling like livestock being appraised for purchase. No, she would not beg. She would not marry out of desperation. She would not give Catherine the satisfaction of watching her crawl. The barn door creaked as wind pressed against it, testing the hinges. Emma moved deeper into the structure, past the stalls where 2 horses shuffled, and breathed warm clouds into the darkening air. The space smelled of hay and manure and old wood, familiar scents that had surrounded her since childhood. Her father had built this barn with his own hands, cutting timber from the foothills and hauling stone from the creek bed. He had taken pride in the work and the solid walls and tight roof that kept weather out and warmth in. Emma ran her fingers along a beam and felt the ghost of his presence in the worn grain. She was not looking for memories. She was looking for a solution. The back corner of the barn had always been a dumping ground for things too broken to use and too potentially useful to throw away. Rusted plows leaned against wheels with cracked spokes. Barrels with split staves were stacked 3 high. A chicken coop her father had built and abandoned when the design proved too small sat collapsed beneath a layer of ancient hay. Emma had passed through this corner 1,000 times without paying it real attention, just another cluttered space in a farm full of them. But today she was not passing through. Today she was desperate, and desperation sharpened vision. The floor looked wrong. It took her several minutes to understand why. The dirt was softer here, slightly sunken compared to the packed earth surrounding it. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the ground. It gave just barely the way earth does when nothing has compressed it for years. Emma grabbed a shovel from the wall and began to dig. Not frantically, not yet, but with methodical determination. The first 6 inches yielded normal Montana soil, rocky and hard-packed from decades of boots and hooves. The next 6 inches changed. The shovel hit wood. She cleared the dirt away, carefully revealing planks laid horizontally across what should have been solid ground. They were old, weathered gray by time and moisture, but still intact. Emma's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She wedged the shovel under one plank and pried. The wood resisted, then gave with a crack that echoed in the empty barn. Beneath the plank was darkness and the smell of earth undisturbed. She lowered herself through the opening feet first, shovel in hand, and dropped into nothing. The fall was shorter than she expected. Her boots hit rocky ground after maybe 7 feet, jolting her knees but causing no damage. Emma stood in absolute blackness and waited for her eyes to adjust. They did not. There was no light to adjust to. She climbed back out, retrieved the oil lamp from its hook by the barn door, and descended again. The space revealed itself in the lamp's golden circle. She stood in a natural void carved into the limestone bedrock beneath the barn, roughly 9 feet wide and 11 feet long, with a ceiling of dirt and stone high enough that she could stand upright without ducking. The walls were earth, not dressed stone, and they showed no sign of human work. This was not a cellar someone had dug. It was a sinkhole or a collapsed mine shaft, some accident of geology that had created empty space beneath a farm built decades after the earth settled. Emma walked the perimeter, slowly testing the walls with her hands. Dirt crumbled at her touch in some places, held firm in others. The floor was uneven, rocky outcroppings interrupting patches of smoother ground. The air was cool but not cold, noticeably warmer than the barn above. She held the lamp high and studied the ceiling. The planks overhead were the only barrier between this void and the barn floor. Someone, probably the farm's original owner, had found this hole and covered it to prevent animals or people from falling through. Then they had forgotten about it or died before passing the knowledge along, and time had buried the secret under junk and accumulated years. Emma climbed out and stood in the barn with her heart racing and her mind working through calculations she barely understood. The void was already excavated. That saved days of digging she did not have. The barn floor hid it perfectly. Michael never used this corner. It was too cluttered and too far from the main doors. If she could make the space livable, if she could hide the entrance well enough, she could stay. Not in town, not in some desperate marriage. Here, underground, invisible. The idea was insane. It was also the only idea she had. She spent the next hour clearing junk away from the opening and assessing what materials the barn held. The collapsed chicken coop could provide lumber for reinforcement. The pile of straw bales near the north wall could serve as insulation. An old stovepipe, rusted but intact, lay half buried under sacks of grain. Emma dragged everything she might need into a pile near the opening and covered it with hay. From a distance, it looked like more barn clutter. Up close, it was a construction site. The sun had set by the time she returned to the house. Catherine was in the kitchen washing dishes with the careful precision of someone performing an unfamiliar task. She glanced at Emma as she entered, but did not speak. Michael sat by the fireplace reading the week-old newspaper from town with the focused attention of a man avoiding conversation. Emma climbed the stairs to the small room she had occupied since childhood, the room Catherine would claim the moment she left, and sat on the bed her father had built. She did not sleep. She planned. 72 hours. 3 nights to transform a hole in the ground into a shelter capable of keeping her alive through a Montana winter. The task lined up in her mind like a list written in fire. Structure, first reinforce the walls so they would not collapse and bury her. Access, second create a hidden entrance she could open and close from inside. Insulation, third trap enough warmth to survive temperatures that would drop far below freezing. Ventilation, fourth ensure fresh air or suffocate in her sleep. Everything else, food, water, light, could be managed if those 4 foundations held. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and groans. She heard Michael's heavy tread on the stairs, the murmur of voices from the bedroom he now shared with Catherine. Emma stared at the ceiling and counted hours until the house fell silent. At midnight, she rose and dressed in her oldest work clothes. The lamp stayed dark. She knew every inch of this house in the dark, every board that creaked and every corner that echoed. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, taking nothing, touching nothing, and slipped out the back door into cold that stole her breath. The barn was a black shape against a blacker sky. No moon. Good. Emma felt her way through the door and across the space to the corner where her future waited. She lit the lamp only after descending into the void where no light would leak through cracks to betray her. Night one was about access and structure. She started with the planks covering the opening. Using a handsaw from her father's tools, she cut a section free to create a rough trap door approximately 4 feet by 3 feet, large enough to pass through with supplies, small enough to disguise. The hinges came from an old trunk moldering in the barn loft, brass fittings, green with age but still functional. Emma attached them with screws salvaged from the chicken coop, working slowly to minimize noise. Each turn of the screwdriver sounded like a shout in the silent barn. The trapdoor swung open smoothly, a rectangle of lesser darkness against the solid black of the void. Emma tested it from below, pushing until it lifted. The hinges held. She lowered it again and studied the closure problem. The door needed to stay shut when walked over, but open easily from beneath. She settled on a simple wooden latch, the kind used on cupboards, installed in reverse so the catch faced down. A piece of leather cord attached to the latch meant she could open it with a pull from inside. Camouflage was next. Emma arranged broken tools and wheels in a careful scatter around the opening, creating a barrier that looked natural but prevented anyone from stepping directly on the trap door. From above, the floor appeared cluttered and unchanged. From below, she had access. The walls were the greater problem. Dirt packed against limestone made for unstable structure. If the walls collapsed, tons of earth would fill the void, and her along with it. Emma had watched her father build and repair structures her entire life, absorbing knowledge the way earth absorbs rain. She understood that dirt walls needed bracing, something to hold them in place and distribute weight. The chicken coop supplied lumber 2x4s cut to 7-foot lengths in 1x6s for cross bracing. She hauled them down piece by piece, working by lamplight in a space that swallowed shadows. The first vertical post went against the north wall. Emma wedged it between floor and ceiling, testing until it held firm. The second post followed 3 feet to the right, then horizontal bracing across the top and bottom, creating a frame. She repeated the process along each wall, building a skeleton of wood against the earth. The gaps between frame and wall she filled with rocks, small stones from the barn floor, and larger ones she carried down from outside. The rocks distributed pressure and prevented the dirt from pushing through the wooden frame. It was crude work, nothing her father would have been proud of, but it was functional. The walls held. Dawn was lightening the eastern sky when Emma climbed out of the void and covered the trapdoor. Her hands were raw with splinters. Her back ached from stooping. She had been underground for 6 hours and completed perhaps a quarter of the work needed. 2 nights remained. She stumbled to the house and washed at the pump, scrubbing dirt from under her nails and hay from her hair. The kitchen was empty. She started breakfast before Catherine came down, performing the routine she had executed every morning for 8 months. Eggs from the hen house, bacon from the smokehouse, bread from the bat she had baked 2 days ago. The smell of cooking food filled the house. Michael appeared first, already dressed for fieldwork. He nodded to her without meeting her eyes and sat at the table. Catherine followed, moving through the kitchen with the careful steps of someone still learning the space. Emma served them both and took her own plate to the counter, eating standing up the way she always had. Neither spoke to her. It was as if she had already left. She spent the day performing her usual tasks: laundry, weeding the kitchen garden, mucking the horse stalls. Her body moved through familiar motions while her mind worked on problems of insulation and ventilation. Catherine watched her occasionally from the house windows, perhaps ensuring she was actually leaving, perhaps just observing the work she would soon inherit. Emma did not care. She saved her energy for nightfall. The second night began the moment the house fell dark. Insulation meant trapping air, creating barriers between the void's interior and the cold that would soon turn Montana into frozen hell. Emma knew this the way she knew that crops needed water and livestock needed feed, knowledge absorbed from years of watching her father prepare for winter. Straw was the answer. Compressed straw trapped air in millions of tiny pockets, and trapped air did not conduct cold. The barn held 24 bales stacked against the north wall. Insurance against a hard winter when hay might run short. Emma took them one at a time, breaking each bale into loose sections and hauling armfuls down into the void. The work was exhausting and endless. Each trip down the ladder meant carrying 30 pounds of prickly, dust-choked straw. Each trip up meant climbing with lungs burning and arms shaking. She worked until 3 in the morning, packing straw between the wooden frame and the earth walls until she had created an 8-inch barrier on all sides. The straw did more than insulate. It absorbed moisture from the earth, preventing the constant dampness that would soak through clothes and leach warmth from skin. Emma pressed her hand against the finished wall and felt the difference immediately. The chill was gone, replaced by a neutral coolness that would hold steady even when surface temperatures plummeted. The sleeping platform came next. Cold air sinks. Emma had learned this as a child, watching candle flames pull smoke upward while frost formed on floors. If she slept on the rocky ground, the coldest air would settle around her and drain heat from her body all night. Height was life. She built a simple frame from the chicken coop's remaining lumber. 4 posts sunk into gaps between rocks. Cross beams lashed with rope planks laid across to create a surface 18 inches above the floor. The mattress was more straw this time, stuffed into burlap sacks, sewn shut with twine. It was lumpy and crude and would probably flatten within a week, but it would lift her above the killing cold. Storage space went beneath the platform. Emma left gaps between the lower cross beams to create a hidden compartment accessible only by reaching under. This would hold water, food, candles, anything she needed to survive and could not risk being found. Ventilation was the problem that could kill her in silence. Carbon dioxide was heavier than air. In a sealed space, it would accumulate near the floor, building up while she slept until her body simply stopped waking. Emma needed constant air exchange, a way to pull fresh air in and push stale air out without creating a visible vent that would give away her presence. The stovepipe solution came from memory. She had watched her father install a similar pipe to ventilate the root cellar years ago, angling it to prevent rain from entering while allowing air to flow. Emma took the old pipe from the barn junk pile and studied the angles. The void ceiling was roughly 6 feet below the barn floor. If she could drill through that earth at a sharp angle and camouflage the exit, she would have ventilation. Drilling through 6 feet of packed dirt and stone with hand tools was the hardest physical work she had ever attempted. Emma used a post hole digger to start driving the blades down and twisting to pull out chunks of earth. Progress was measured in inches. Her shoulders screamed. Blisters formed, burst, and reformed on her palms. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from an old shirt and kept digging. 4 hours later, she broke through. Cold air rushed down the opening, crisp and clean, and tasting of freedom. Emma fed the stovepipe through at a 40-degree angle, pushing until only 6 inches protruded from the ceiling. The exit would be above ground, somewhere in the barn. She climbed out to locate it. The pipe emerged beneath the pile of hay bales she had already depleted. Perfect. Emma repositioned bales to hide the opening completely, while leaving gaps for air to flow. From any angle, it looked like storage. From below, it was a lifeline. She tested the system with a lit candle held near the pipe's entrance. The flame bent toward the opening, pulled by the draft. Fresh air was flowing down. Stale air had somewhere to go. Emma would not suffocate in her sleep. Dawn arrived too quickly. She had been underground for 7 hours and her body was failing. The climb out of the void felt like scaling a mountain. Emma covered the trap door, scattered straw to hide her tracks, and staggered to the house on legs that barely held her weight. Catherine was already in the kitchen frying eggs with careful concentration. She glanced at Emma's dirt-streaked face and hay-covered clothes, but said nothing. Emma washed at the pump until the water ran clear, changed into clean work clothes, and began her daily tasks. Michael came down for breakfast. The newspaper occupied his attention. Catherine mentioned that she was going to town today. She needed fabric for curtains Michael could drive her. He agreed without looking up. Emma worked through the day in a haze of exhaustion. Her hands moved automatically, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, hoeing the garden. Her mind was already underground, planning the final night's work. Supplies. That was what remained. Food to steal, water to carry, candles to hide. Everything she would need to survive in darkness for however long winter lasted. The third night was about theft and survival. Emma waited until the house had been silent for 2 hours before moving. Michael and Catherine had returned from town at dinner, Catherine excited about fabric and ribbon. Michael quietly pleased that his wife was happy. They had gone to bed early. Emma gave them time to fall into deep sleep before rising. The stealing had to be strategic. Take too much and the theft would be noticed. Take too little and she would starve. Emma moved through the dark house with the lamp unlit, navigating by memory and touch. The linen closet held blankets her mother had woven years ago, old ones relegated to the back when Catherine brought her Boston linens. Emma took 2 wool blankets, thick and heavy, and a lighter quilt that had seen better days. The gaps in the closet would not be obvious. Catherine had brought enough of her own bedding to fill 3 closets. The guest room, unused since her parents died, provided a second wool blanket and a pair of thick socks. Emma added a wool undershirt from her own drawer, one Catherine had already claimed, by placing it in the to-be-altered pile. These were garments that would not be missed because no one remembered they existed. Kitchen supplies came next. A tin cup, a single spoon, a small knife normally used for paring vegetables. Emma left the larger knives, the ones Michael used for butchering. A missing paring knife could be explained as misplaced. A missing butcher knife would raise questions. Candles were a calculated risk. The house had perhaps 30 scattered through various rooms. Emma took 12 from the pantry stash, leaving 23. The count looked wrong if studied carefully, but who counted candles? She wrapped them in a cloth bag to prevent rattling. Matches posed a greater problem. The household kept them in a tin by the stove, a communal resource everyone used. Emma counted out 30 matches and left them wrapped in wax paper in her pocket. She would have to be careful with fire. Every match was precious. Food could not be taken from the house. Catherine was already managing the kitchen with an accountant's precision, noting when supplies ran low and adding them to lists. Any missing staples would be discovered. Emma would have to steal from the root cellar in the barn, where produce was stored in bulk and small losses would go unnoticed. She made 3 trips to the barn, carrying her stolen goods in careful loads. Each item went down into the void and into the storage space beneath the sleeping platform. By 3 in the morning, she had assembled a survival cache, 5 blankets, extra clothing, 12 candles, matches, eating utensils, 1 small knife. It was not much. It would have to be enough. The root cellar attached to the barn's south side was a low stone structure her father had built to keep vegetables cool through summer and frost-free through winter. Emma had been managing it since her mother died, rotating stock and culling spoiled produce. She knew its contents precisely. 8 potatoes came from a bin holding over 200, 2 onions from a string of 40, a handful of dried beans from a barrel, quantities so small they could be explained as shrinkage, as produce given to neighbors as her own consumption before leaving. Emma wrapped them in a cloth bag and added them to her underground stores. Water was the final necessity. The barn well was closer than the house pump and less likely to be heard. Emma filled a 2-gallon clay jug, sealed it with a cork, and lowered it carefully into the void. Water was heavy, but water was life. She would refill when she could during late-night raids, but this gave her a buffer. The void was no longer empty. It was a shelter, crude and minimal, but functional. Emma stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, cataloging what she had built. Reinforced walls that would not collapse, straw insulation 8 inches thick, a raised sleeping platform, ventilation that would keep air fresh, storage for supplies, a hidden entrance that looked like barn floor. She had turned a geological accident into a home. Not a home she wanted, not a home anyone would choose, but a home that would keep her alive while the world above forgot she existed. Emma climbed out and spent an hour perfecting the camouflage. The broken tools and wagon wheels formed a barrier around the trap door, arranged to look random while preventing anyone from stepping directly on the hidden entrance. She scattered hay to match the surrounding floor. She moved a barrel 2 feet to the left to make the whole corner look undisturbed. From the barn door, the space looked exactly as it always had, cluttered, ignored, unimportant. She returned to the house at 5 in the morning, an hour before Catherine usually rose. The sky was lightning stars fading into gray that promised another cold day. Emma washed at the pump and changed into her traveling dress, the good one she wore to church. The rest of her clothes were already packed in the small bag she would carry when she left. Catherine came down at 6, found Emma already dressed, and smiled. Not warmly, but with satisfaction. Today was November 1st. Today Emma left. Breakfast was silent. Michael ate without raising his eyes from his plate. Catherine hummed softly some Boston tune Emma did not recognize. Emma forced down eggs and bread she could not taste, fueling her body for the performance ahead. At 8 o'clock, she carried her bag outside and loaded it onto the neighbor's mule borrowed yesterday under the pretense of hauling supplies. Michael followed her out, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked like he wanted to speak, like words were building behind his teeth, but nothing emerged. Emma did not wait. She climbed onto the mule and turned its head toward the road. The ride to town took 90 minutes over frozen ruts that jarred her spine. She sold the story carefully, asked at the general store about work, let the clerk tell her there was nothing, mentioned to the hotel cook that she was staying with an aunt in the next county over near Great Falls, made sure 3 people heard her plans to leave Montana entirely to try her luck in Oregon, where land was still available and work was easier to find. She bought supplies she did not need with money she had saved over 8 months, thread buttons, a tin of crackers. Evidence of a woman preparing for travel. At dusk, she tied the mule outside the boarding house and went inside asking about rooms. The owner quoted a price she could not afford. Emma thanked her and left. She waited in the alley beside the mercantile until full dark, then untied the mule and rode out of town, heading west, the direction of Oregon. 2 miles out, she turned north. 4 miles later, she left the road entirely and cut across open country toward the abandoned Miller place, a homestead that had failed 3 years ago when drought killed the crops and debt killed the dream. The cabin was a skeleton now, roof collapsed and walls leaning, but the small barn still stood. Emma tied the mule inside out of sight from the road and left it with enough hay to last 3 days. Someone would find it. The neighbor who owned it would get his animal back. Everyone would assume Emma had left it when she caught a train or a wagon heading west. The walk back to the farm took 2 hours across frozen fields that stretched empty under a moonless sky. Emma moved carefully, testing each step, avoiding the road where tracks would show. Cold penetrated her coat and dress, numbing her fingers and toes. She focused on breathing and moving one foot in front of the other, covering ground that she knew like her own reflection. The farm appeared as a dark shape against darker hills. No lights in the house. Michael and Catherine were asleep, satisfied that the problem of Emma had been solved. She circled wide, approaching the barn from the north side where no windows faced. The door opened silently, well-oiled hinges her father had maintained and she had inherited the care of. Inside, she stood in complete darkness and listened. Horse breathing, mice in the walls, wind testing the roof. No human sounds. Emma felt her way to the back corner, found the trap door by touch, moved the camouflage aside. The leather cord was exactly where she had left it. She pulled. The trap door rose smoothly. Emma lowered herself through the opening feet, finding the rungs of the ladder she had installed during night one. She descended into absolute black, pulling her bag behind her. Once inside, she reached up with the long stick she had positioned for exactly this purpose and dragged tools and wheels back over the opening. The trap door settled into place with a soft thump. She pulled it closed from below. The latch caught. Light vanished completely. Emma stood in darkness, so total it felt solid, a physical presence pressing against her eyes. She had practiced moving in this space, counting steps and memorizing distances, but practice and reality were different creatures. Her heart hammered. Her breath came fast. She forced herself, still forced her lungs to slow, forced her mind to accept what her body wanted to reject. This was home now, 7 feet underground, 9 by 11 feet of space, no light, no sound, no company but her own thoughts. She felt her way to the sleeping platform and sat on the straw mattress. The temperature was cool, but not cold, maybe 45 degrees. Warmer than the barn above. far warmer than the fields where wind was already stripping heat from anything exposed. The earth surrounded her like a blanket, heavy and constant, and indifferent to human suffering. Emma pulled the wool blankets from her bag and wrapped herself in layers. She had candles but would not light one yet. Candles were for emergencies, for moments when darkness became unbearable. Tonight she needed to prove she could survive without them. 13 weeks until spring, 91 days. She counted them in her mind, a litany against panic. 91 sunrises she would not see. 91 sunsets she would miss. 91 days of living like something already buried. Her fingers found the knife in her pocket, in the barn wall within arm's reach. She carved a single line into the wood of the sleeping platform's frame. Day 1, 90 remained. Above, the farm went about its business. Michael would wake tomorrow and feel relief that the problem had solved itself. Catherine would claim the empty bedroom and hang her Boston curtains. The chickens would lay eggs. The horses would eat hay. Life would continue exactly as it had, minus one unwanted woman who had simply done what she was told and left. Except she had not left. She had gone deeper. While they walked on floorboards and lived in firelight, she would exist in earth and darkness, invisible and impossible and alive. Emma lay back on the straw and stared up into nothing. Her body ached. Her hands were raw. Her future was a hole in the ground that might become a grave if winter proved too cruel or her preparations too weak. But she was here. She had chosen this. The farm could expel her from the surface, but it could not expel her from its bones. She closed her eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute dark, and waited for sleep. Above, wind rattled the barn. Winter was coming. She would meet it on her terms and her place by her rules. They had wanted her gone. She had given them exactly that, in a way they would never comprehend. While they slept warm in beds she had made and ate food she had prepared and lived in comfort, she had maintained she would survive beneath their feet, on scraps and darkness and determination sharp enough to cut. The earth closed around her like a fist, and Emma Hartwell disappeared into its grasp. Day 4. I've forgotten what light looks like. Emma carved the fourth line into the platform frame and let her fingers trace the grooves she could not see. Time had become a strange fluid thing in the absolute dark, stretching and compressing until she could no longer trust her instincts about how long she had been awake or asleep. Her body insisted on rhythms the earth did not share. She would sleep for what felt like hours, wake, convinced morning had arrived, and lie in blackness with no way to confirm or deny the feeling. The only reliable measure was hunger, which arrived with a mechanical regularity and reminded her that bodies demanded fuel regardless of circumstances. The darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a presence, thick and textured, pressing against her eyeballs until she saw phantom colors that swirled and shifted behind her lids. She had learned to keep her eyes open or closed with equal indifference, since neither state changed what she perceived. The mind deprived of visual input invented its own entertainment. Flashes that looked like distant lightning. Geometric patterns that assembled and dissolved. Once she would have sworn she saw her mother's face perfect and clear before it scattered into fragments. Sound became her new vision. She learned to distinguish between the scuttle of mice in the walls and the tick of settling earth. The ventilation pipes sang in different keys depending on wind speed above ground. When Michael walked into the barn, his weight transmitted through 6 feet of soil as a low vibration she felt more than heard. She had counted his visits 11 times in 4 days, each one sending her heart into her throat until his footsteps retreated and the barn door closed. The cold was constant but manageable. Emma wore every piece of clothing she owned in layers: 2 pairs of socks, wool underthings, her work dress, her good dress. Over that, the coat she had planned to wear to town, all of it wrapped in blankets when she lay on the platform. The temperature in her shelter held steady, somewhere she estimated at 45 degrees, cold enough to require all her insulation, but warm enough that frostbite was not an immediate threat. Her breath did not fog. Ice did not form on the walls. The earth kept its promise, maintaining the temperature it had held for centuries, regardless of what the surface weather chose to do. Food management consumed her thoughts during waking hours. The 4 potatoes she had brought down on the first night would last 4 days if she ate one per day, but 4 days was not 13 weeks. Mathematics was simple and brutal. She needed food every day. She had food for 4 days, therefore she needed to acquire more food. The root cellar in the barn held vegetables in quantities that would feed a household through winter. Emma needed only enough to feed one person, and she needed it badly enough to risk everything. The first raid happened on night 4. Emma counted hours by her heartbeat, estimating when true midnight had passed and the house had fallen into deepest sleep. She had trained herself to sleep during what she guessed was afternoon, saving her energy for nighttime operations. The trap door opened silently, the leather cord releasing the latch without sound. She pushed up, slowly, testing for resistance, and emerged into the barn's darkness. After 4 days underground, even the barn's minimal light felt like assault. Starlight leaked through gaps in the walls, faint silver threads that seemed bright as noon to her adapted eyes. Emma crouched beside the opening and waited for her vision to settle, fighting the urge to move quickly. Haste made noise. Noise brought discovery. She had all night. The root cellar door was 20 paces from the trap door. 20 paces she had walked thousands of times, but never with stakes this high. Each step was placed with surgical care testing for creaking boards before committing her weight. The cellar door opened on hinges she had oiled herself just weeks ago. Cold air rolled out, carrying the earthy smell of stored vegetables. Emma had memorized the cellar's layout during 8 months of managing it. Potatoes in bins along the left wall, sorted by size. Carrots in sandboxes to the right. Onions hanging in strings from the ceiling beams. Turnips in barrels. She took 2 potatoes from the largest bin, choosing from the middle where gaps would not show. 1 carrot from a box holding 30. Her hands moved by touch and memory, selecting without seeing. The water jug was half empty. She filled it from the well in the barn's corner, working the pump handle with agonizing slowness to minimize squeaking. Fresh water tasted like victory. 20 minutes after emerging, she descended back into her shelter with supplies that bought her 3 more days. The trap door closed. Darkness returned. Emma sat on her platform and ate half a raw potato, chewing slowly to make it last, and felt something close to triumph. 3 nights later, she repeated the process. 2 potatoes, 1 turnip, water. The routine established itself, 3 nights underground, 1 night raiding. It was sustainable as long as the food lasted and Michael did not lock the cellar. Week 2 brought the mice. Emma had heard them from the first night, skittering in the spaces between her wooden wall frames and the earth beyond. Mice were ubiquitous in barns, unavoidable facts of farm life that ate grain and left droppings and occasionally bit when cornered. She had killed hundreds over the years with traps and cats and a shovel when necessary. Now they represented something different. Protein. Trapping them required patience and materials she barely possessed. Emma fashioned a snare from the twine that had wrapped her blankets, creating a loop attached to a stick wedged into a gap in the wall. She baited it with crumbs of potato and waited. Mice were cautious but predictable. They investigated food. They followed the same paths repeatedly. She heard one approach her trap on the second night, heard the skitter of claws on wood, the pause as it tested the air, the rustle as it reached for the bait. The snare pulled tight. The mouse thrashed a brief, violent struggle that ended when Emma grabbed it through the twine and twisted. The body went limp. She had killed animals before, chickens and rabbits, and once a pig, but never in total darkness and never this close. The mouse was warm in her palm. Tiny heart already stopped. Life fled in seconds. Cooking it was the challenge she had not fully solved. Fire required fuel and created smoke, both of which would announce her presence to anyone in the barn. But raw mouse was a path to illness she could not afford. Emma compromised with the smallest possible fire, 1 candle lit in a depression she had carved in the rock floor. The mouse held directly in the flame and rotated until the skin charred and the smell of cooking meat filled her shelter. It tasted like survival, barely cooked, stringy, flavored with desperation. She ate every scrap, cracking the tiny bones between her teeth to suck out marrow. The protein was negligible but real. Combined with her stolen vegetables, it stretched her supplies another day. By week 3, she had caught and eaten 4 mice. By week 4, the mice had learned. They avoided her traps, took routes that bypassed her snares, demonstrated the evolutionary pressure of predation in real time. Emma adapted, moving her traps, trying new locations, accepting that this food source was declining. The raids continued every 3 nights, but she noticed Michael lingering in the barn more often, as if sensing something wrong he could not identify. The cold above ground intensified according to the signals that reached her underground. The ventilation pipe's song changed pitch as wind speeds increased. Temperature in her shelter dropped 2 degrees, settling at 43. Frost penetrated deeper into the earth, and she felt the ground itself shift with almost imperceptible movements as water froze and expanded in soil layers she could not see. Above, parallel to her existence, but separated by 6 feet of earth, life continued with problems she could track by sound. Catherine's voice carried through the barn floor on still days, sharp with complaint about the cold house and insufficient firewood. Michael's responses were muffled, but placating. Emma heard their arguments as a kind of music rhythm and tone, conveying meaning even when words were lost. One conversation came through clearly enough to parse. Catherine wanted to return to Boston. The Montana winter was unbearable. The house was inadequate. She had made a mistake marrying a farmer. Michael's reply was barely audible, but the desperation in his voice transcended volume. They could not afford travel. The farm was all they had. She needed to understand this was permanent. Emma lay on her platform and listened to the woman who had displaced her, begged to escape the life that had been forced upon her. There was no satisfaction in it, just a recognition that comfort and survival were not the same thing, and Catherine had optimized for the former, while Emma had chosen the latter. Week 5 brought the first crisis that nearly ended everything. Emma emerged for her scheduled raid and found the root cellar door secured with a heavy padlock, new metal gleaming even in starlight. Michael had noticed the shrinkage. The gaps she had thought invisible had been seen. Her food source was gone. She stood in the barn with her empty jug and felt panic rise like water in a drowning. The potatoes in her shelter would last 2 days. After that, nothing. Mice were essentially gone trap-wise and educated beyond her ability to catch. The garden had been harvested. The chickens were locked in their coop at night. She could not steal from the house without walking past the bedroom where Michael and Catherine slept, risking every creak and shadow. Starvation was a slow killer, but a certain one. Emma returned to her shelter and portioned her remaining food into half servings. 1 potato became 2 meals. Hunger stopped being a discomfort and became a constant companion, a voice that never stopped whispering about emptiness and need. On the 2nd night after finding the lock, she climbed out and spent an hour searching the barn for anything edible. She found grain intended for horses, hard kernels of oats that she could not digest raw and could not cook without dangerous fire. She found dried corn on cobs hung from rafters, food for chickens that was food for her if she was desperate enough. She took 2 cobs and descended, and eating raw corn was an exercise in jaw exhaustion. The kernels were rock hard, requiring minutes of chewing to break down into paste that could be swallowed. It provided calories, but at an energy cost that nearly negated the benefit. Emma ate half a cob over the course of an hour and felt her teeth ache with the effort. Week 6 was the week she learned what real hunger felt like. Not the empty stomach of a skipped meal, but the systemic starvation that made her body consume itself. Her clothes, already loose, began to hang like fabric on bones. Her hands became skeletal tendons and veins visible under skin that seemed thinner each day. Hair came out when she ran her fingers through it, just a few strands at first, then small clumps that frightened her with what they implied about malnutrition. Weakness arrived gradually, then all at once. The exercises she had maintained, daily squats and push-ups and walking circles in the dark, became impossible. She managed 20 squats before her legs trembled too badly to continue. Push-ups were abandoned entirely. Walking circles made her dizzy and short of breath, as if the air itself had thinned. Emma spent more time lying down, conserving energy, moving only when necessary. Her body adapted to scarcity by slowing everything. Her heart rate decreased. Her hands and feet were constantly cold now as blood retreated to her core. She slept longer and longer periods, 16 hours at a stretch, waking only to drink water and return to unconsciousness that was easier than awareness. Week 7 was the week she gave up. The decision came in stages, not a single moment, but an accumulation of impossibilities. She was too weak to climb out of the shelter. The ladder that had been easy in week 1 was now a vertical challenge her muscles could not meet. She tried twice and made it halfway before her arms gave out and she dropped back to the floor. The trap door might as well have been a mile above her. Even if she could climb out, where would she go? Michael's house to beg for food and shelter and admit defeat. Town 8 miles away on foot, she could no longer walk. She had no money, no friends, no options that did not involve complete surrender. Emma lay on her platform, wrapped in blankets, and made peace with dying. It would be slow, but probably not painful, just a gradual dimming as her body shut down system by system. They would find her eventually, months or years from now, a skeleton in a hole that no one knew existed. Michael would never know how close she had been, living beneath his feet, surviving on scraps of his plenty. There was a bitter poetry in that. She climbed to the trap door one final time, using the last reserves of strength her body possessed. The ladder rungs felt like cliffs. Her arms shook. Her vision went gray at the edges, not that grayness meant anything in absolute dark. She reached the trap door and put her hand on the latch. Through the floorboards, above, Catherine's voice carried with unusual clarity. She was talking to someone, probably Michael, about the departed sister. "Good riddance to that lazy girl." The words were casual, dismissive, erasing Emma's 8 months of labor with a single sentence that cost nothing to speak and cut like wire. Emma's hand fell away from the latch. She descended on legs that barely functioned and lay back on her platform. Rage, it turned out, was fuel. Catherine could dismiss her. Michael could forget her. The world could write her off as a problem solved, but she would not give them the satisfaction of being right. She would not die down here and prove them correct. If her body could not exercise, she would let it rest. If she could not find food, she would need less food. Hibernation was a word she knew from her father's stories about bears in the mountains, animals that slowed their bodies to near death and survived months without eating. Emma was not a bear, but desperation made her willing to try anything that was not surrender. She stopped moving, except to drink water, stopped trying to stay warm through activity, let her body temperature drop until she shivered constantly but used minimal energy, slept 20 hours out of 24, became as much as a human could dormant. Her core temperature fell to 94 degrees. Her pulse slowed to 40 beats per minute. She existed in a twilight state between consciousness and coma, aware enough to drink when thirst woke her, absent enough that time passed without measurement. 3 days became 5. 5 became 7. She lost track somewhere around day 10 of this hibernation, drifting in darkness that was internal as much as external. Week 8 ended with her still alive, still breathing, using so little energy that her body's reserves could sustain her for weeks more. It was not living. It was not dying. It was existing in the space between, waiting for some external change that might never come. The change arrived through the ventilation pipe carried on wind that spoke of weather transforming above ground. Emma woke from her semi-conscious state to air that felt different, charged with pressure that made her ears pop. The earth around her shelter transmitted vibrations that were new, a deep tremor that suggested massive forces moving overhead. Temperature in her shelter stable for weeks dropped 3 degrees in what she estimated was 6 hours, 43 to 40. The earth was losing its battle with whatever cold had arrived above. If the surface was cold enough to penetrate this deep, conditions up there were beyond anything Montana normally experienced. Through the floor sounds of crisis, footsteps running, Michael's voice raised in something between anger and fear. A crash that might have been furniture moved or dropped. Catherine crying or yelling, the tone unmistakable, even when words were lost. Emma forced herself to sit up, a process that took minutes and left her gasping. Her body had adapted to stillness, and movement was a violence against systems that had shut down to conserve energy. She wrapped herself in every blanket and listened. Michael was in the barn. She heard the door bang open, heard his boots on the floor above her, heard the frantic scrape of metal on frozen ground. He was digging throwing tools aside, searching for something in desperation that made him careless and loud. His voice reached her clearly for the first time in weeks, talking to himself the way desperate people do. Catherine was dying. The house was too cold. The fireplace could not keep up. He needed shelter, needed something, needed help that was not available because no one could reach them through whatever had closed the roads. Emma understood with sudden clarity that the storm she had felt building through earth and air had arrived with force that was killing people above ground. The house Michael trusted was failing. Catherine, the Boston woman who had never experienced real cold, was freezing to death in a structure built for milder winters. And Michael, the brother who had chosen his wife over his sister, was standing 6 feet above the only shelter that could save them, digging random holes in frozen ground. The choice presented itself with brutal simplicity. Let them die, which would be justice of a sort, or reveal herself and save them, which would be mercy she was not sure they deserved. Emma considered her options with a mind that had been clarified by weeks of starvation and isolation. Revenge would be easy. Stay hidden. Wait. Michael and Catherine would freeze, and she would die down here with them, but she would die knowing they had learned what cold really meant. There was satisfaction in that, imagining dark and complete. But dying to prove a point was still dying. And letting people freeze when she had the power to save them would make her something she had spent 8 weeks proving she was not. Survival without humanity was just existence, and she had not endured this long to become hollow. Michael was crying now. She could hear it in his breathing, great gasping sobs of a man who had run out of solutions. He called Catherine's name, called for God, called for help that could not reach him. Emma used the last of her strength to climb the ladder. Her arms shook so badly she nearly fell twice. Her legs would not support her weight, and she had to pull herself up using only her arms, fingers cramping around the rungs. The trap door was impossibly heavy, or she was impossibly weak, probably both. She pushed. It did not move. She pushed again, committing everything, and felt it shift. One more push, and it lifted fresh air, rushing down, air so cold it burned her lungs. Michael stood 10 feet away, with a shovel in his hands and defeat on his face. He turned at the sound of the opening, saw the trap door rising from the floor, saw a skeletal hand emerge, followed by a shape that had been a person and was now something closer to a ghost. Emma pulled herself out into barn air that felt warm compared to the storm outside, but cold enough to kill anyone exposed. She knelt on the floor, too weak to stand, and looked at her brother with eyes that had not seen light in 8 weeks. Michael. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse, cracked from dehydration, but it carried in the shocked silence. He stared at her like she was an apparition, something his mind had conjured from desperation. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. The shovel fell from his hands and hit the floor with a clang that echoed. "Bring Catherine, now." Emma gestured toward the opening in the floor, toward the darkness below that had kept her alive while the world above failed. Michael's eyes went from her face to the hole to her face again, understanding arriving in stages too fast to process. "You've been, how long?" "Since November 1st. Bring her down." "There's no time." Whatever else Michael was, he was not stupid. He ran for the barn door, stumbled in his haste, caught himself, and disappeared into wind that howled with voices. Emma sat beside the opening and waited, conserving what little energy remained. She had made the choice. Now she would live with consequences. Michael returned carrying Catherine wrapped in quilts like a child. Her face was blue-white lips, darker blue eyes half closed. Hypothermia at an advanced stage, maybe past the point of saving, but maybe not. Michael started to lower her toward the opening and realized he could not manage the ladder while carrying her weight. Emma descended first, moving like an old woman using the last thing she had. At the bottom, she called up for him to lower Catherine. He did, passing her down as gently as panic allowed. Emma caught her, or tried to, and they both collapsed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Michael came down, fast boots, skipping rungs, bringing cold air with him that made the shelter feel like winter had invaded. Emma pointed to the sleeping platform. He lifted Catherine onto it and wrapped her in the blankets Emma had been using, all of them, everything. The shelter temperature was 40 degrees. Outside was probably 40 below. The difference was life and death. Emma pulled herself onto the platform's edge and began rubbing Catherine's hands, trying to restore circulation to extremities that felt like ice. Michael did the same with her feet, working frantically, breathing hard. Catherine's eyes opened, slightly unfocused and confused. Her lips tried to form words, but only a faint moan emerged. She was alive, barely hypothermia's grip, loosening in the relatively warmer air but not releasing yet. They worked in silence for hours that stretched in compressed time, becoming meaningless again, but for different reasons. Emma showed Michael how to rotate body parts, where to rub, when to stop before causing damage. She had no medical training, just farm experience with animals brought back from the edge of freezing, but the principles translated. Gradually, over what might have been 3 hours or 6, Catherine's color improved. Blue faded to white, faded to pink. Her breathing deepened. Her eyes focused on Michael's face and registered recognition. Where her voice was a thread of sound. Emma's shelter, underground, were safe. Catherine's eyes moved to Emma, took in the skeletal figure wrapped in a single thin blanket, the face that was all bones and shadows, the hands that were still rubbing warmth into her arms. No words came. What words existed for this? The woman she had expelled was saving her life in a shelter she had built to survive the expulsion. Emma stopped rubbing and sat back, exhausted beyond measure. Michael was staring at the space around them, seeing it for the first time now that the immediate crisis had passed. The straw-insulated walls, the raised platform, the ventilation pipe, the storage area beneath. His voice when he spoke was hollow. "How long have you been down here?" 8 weeks, almost 9. "Living like this, alone in the dark?" "Yes. We thought you went to Oregon, to family. I let you think that. It was easier." Michael looked at the trap door above, calculating distances and implications. "You've been here the whole time, under the barn. We walked over you. Every day." Catherine tried to sit up, managed with Michael's help. She pulled the blankets tighter and looked at Emma with an expression that mixed shock and horror, and something else Emma could not identify. "You survived, down here, while we—" "Yes." A long silence filled only by the wind outside, muffled by earth, but still audible, still threatening. Catherine's next words were barely audible. "Why did you save us?" Emma considered the question from angles Catherine could not see, weighed answers against truths she barely understood herself. "Because you would have died, and I would have known. That's enough." Michael put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Emma did not know if he was crying or laughing or simply breaking under the weight of what he had learned. The storm raged above them. 3 people sat in a shelter built for one, saved by the person they had tried to erase, and waited for weather to release its grip. Emma lay back on the edge of the platform, giving Catherine the better space, and closed her eyes. Her body demanded rest it had earned. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new configurations, new impossibilities to navigate. Tonight she had done what she had done, and it would have to be enough. Through the ventilation pipe, wind sang its deepest song, the voice of winter at full strength. But down here, temperature held at 40 degrees, and 3 lives continued in the space between buried and saved. The first 12 hours in the shelter with 3 people taught Emma that hell was not fire but proximity. The space that had felt survivable when she occupied it alone became a cage when Michael and Catherine's breathing filled the air she needed. When their bodies radiated heat, she had learned to generate sparingly, when every shift in movement reminded her that the sanctuary she had built was now invaded by the people it was built to escape. Catherine slept fitfully on the platform wrapped in blankets Emma had stolen and preserved through 9 weeks of discipline. Michael sat on the floor with his back against the straw-insulated wall, silent for long stretches, then asking questions Emma had no energy to answer. How had she built this? Where did she get food? What had she done for light? Each question felt like an itemization of suffering he had caused and was only now beginning to comprehend. Emma huddled in the corner farthest from both of them, wrapped in the single thin blanket they had left her after taking everything else to save Catherine. The irony was not lost on her. She had given up her insulation, her platform, her supplies to rescue the woman who had ordered her gone and the brother who had allowed it. Virtue was supposed to bring warmth. Instead, it brought shivers that would not stop. The storm outside made itself known through the ventilation pipe, a howl that varied in pitch, but never ceased. Michael climbed out once briefly after the first 6 hours to assess conditions. He returned white-faced and shaking ice crystals coating his hair and eyebrows. The barn was survivable only by comparison to outside where wind chill was killing anything exposed. The house was essentially abandoned, its interior temperature approaching whatever the thermometer registered beyond the walls. He had brought food from the locked cellar, the padlock key retrieved from his pocket with fumbling fingers. Potatoes, carrots, onions, a smoked ham wrapped in cloth, provisions for 3 people for perhaps a week stacked in the storage space beneath the platform that Emma had designed for one person's meager supplies. Michael arranged them carefully as if organization could somehow atone for the 9 weeks Emma had starved, while this abundance sat 20 feet above her head. Catherine woke on the second day lucid enough to understand where she was and how she had arrived. She sat up slowly, took in the dimensions of the shelter, studied the straw walls and crude platform, and the skeletal woman sitting in the corner, watching her with eyes that reflected nothing. You built this in 3 days. I did what was necessary. We thought you left. We believed you were gone. You wanted me gone, I gave you that, just not the way you imagined. Catherine's hands moved to her throat, touching the skin there, as if checking for her own pulse, confirming she was real and alive. Her gaze swept the shelter, again lingering on details that told stories she was only beginning to read. The scratches on the platform frame marking days, the careful arrangement of storage, the ventilation pipe that meant someone had planned for long-term survival rather than temporary hiding. How long were you down here before we— 9 weeks, almost to the day. The number sat between them like a physical object. 9 weeks alone in darkness. 9 weeks stealing food in amounts too small to notice. 9 weeks breathing stale air and moving through black so complete it redefined the word. Catherine's face showed the math calculating behind her eyes, working backward, from the storm to the day Emma had ridden away on a borrowed mule, understanding arriving in stages that transformed her expression from shock to something closer to horror. We walked over you. I was in the barn. I stood 6 feet above my head. Yes, I heard you. Michael moved then, positioning himself between the women as if physical space could somehow reduce the weight of what was being acknowledged. His voice carried strain that suggested he had not slept despite the exhaustion visible in every line of his body. Emma, I need you to understand we didn't know. If we had any idea you were suffering like this, you would have let me stay, given me a room in the house you gave to your wife, split the farm, father left to you alone. The questions landed like stones. Michael had no answers because there were no good answers, just the reality of laws that favored sons and customs that assumed women would marry or disappear into someone else's household. He had followed those rules without questioning them, and now the consequences sat in physical form in a hole beneath his barn. Emma pushed herself to her feet, legs trembling with effort that should not be required for such a simple act. She was still too weak for extended standing, still recovering from self-imposed hibernation that had kept her alive but cost her muscle and mass she could not afford to lose. But sitting while Catherine occupied the platform Emma had built, felt like conceding territory she had already surrendered too much of. I'm going up. I need to check the animals. Michael stood quickly, blocking the ladder. The storm's still too strong. You can't. I survived 9 weeks down here. I can survive walking across a barn. She pushed past him with strength she did not have, climbing the ladder on arms that shook and threatened to give out. The trap door was heavy, almost too heavy, but rage made temporary fuel and she shoved it open. Cold air fell through the opening like liquid, stealing breath and vision. Emma pulled herself through anyway, emerging into a barn that was barely warmer than the storm outside. The horses stood in their stalls, with frost coating their muzzles, breathing clouds that hung in air too cold to dissipate quickly. Emma gave them hay from the remaining pile, checked their water bucket, and found ice broke through it with her elbow because she could not find a tool in the dark. The chickens were silent in their coop, either sleeping or dead. She did not check. There were limits to what she could face. When she returned to the opening, Catherine had climbed out and stood wrapped in blankets, staring at the scatter of broken tools and wagon wheels that camouflaged the entrance. She kicked at a wheel, watching it roll aside to reveal the trap door beneath. You hid this from us for 9 weeks. I hid myself from you. This was just the method. We could have helped if you had just asked. I asked by existing, by working this farm for 8 months without pay, by keeping food on your table and clothes on your back. You answered by giving me 3 days to disappear. Catherine's mouth closed, opened again. Whatever response she had prepared dissolved before reaching her lips. Emma descended back into the shelter, and Catherine followed, both of them refugees from cold that killed without malice or mercy. The storm lasted 3 days total, 3 days of wind that never stopped, of cold that penetrated through earth and straw and will. The shelter's temperature dropped to 38 degrees on the second day, low enough that Emma wondered if the thermal mass of Earth had limits she had not calculated. They burned one candle for light and psychological comfort, the flame providing minimal heat but maximum reminder that they were not yet buried. Michael rationed the food he had brought with careful precision, dividing portions equally among 3 people. Emma ate her share and felt her body begin the slow process of recovery, cells remembering what fuel was and what it could do. The weakness that had defined her for weeks began to recede, replaced by strength that was still minimal, but improving with each meal. On the 3rd day, the wind finally died. The silence was so profound after 72 hours of constant noise that Emma's ears rang, trying to fill the void. Michael climbed out first, staying up for almost an hour before returning with news delivered in a voice that carried no inflection at all. The house was uninhabitable. Burst pipes, cracked walls, interior coated in frost that would not melt until spring. The barn was intact, but barely. The livestock had survived, though the chickens had lost 3 to cold. Snow had drifted to 6 feet in places higher, where wind had sculpted it against structures. The road to town was impassable and would remain so until a thaw that might not come for weeks. They were trapped, not just in the farm, but in the shelter, the only space warm enough to sustain human life until the crisis passed or help arrived or winter loosened its grip. Catherine absorbed this information, sitting on the platform that was increasingly becoming hers by default of need. She had been hypothermic, had nearly died, and her body was still recovering in ways that required rest. Emma's body had not been granted. The unfairness of this was obvious to everyone and addressed by no one. How long can we stay down here? Michael looked to Emma, automatically deferring to expertise earned through suffering he could not imagine. Food for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. Water as long as the well doesn't freeze. Air is fine as long as the ventilation pipe stays clear. And after 2 weeks, we hope the road clears. We hope someone can reach us. We hope. Hope was not a plan, but it was what they had. Michael began making regular trips to the surface, clearing snow from the barn door, tending animals, checking the house for any change that might make it livable again. He found none. The structure that had cost his father years to build was now a monument to inadequate preparation, walls designed for weather that no longer matched what Montana delivered. Emma and Catherine were left alone during these trips, two women in a 9 by 11 space with history that filled more volume than their bodies. The first day passed in silence, broken only by necessary communication about water or food or the candle burning too low. The second day brought Catherine's voice tentative and testing. Can I ask how you knew how to build this? I didn't know. I guess based on what my father taught me about root cellars and cold storage. The earth keeps a constant temperature at depth. Everything else was just keeping that temperature inside instead of letting it leak out. But the planning, the ventilation, the insulation, all of it in 72 hours. Desperation focuses the mind. You should understand that. You were desperate enough to come down here when the alternative was freezing. Catherine flinched but did not retreat. I was wrong about you, about what you were capable of, about what farm work meant. You were wrong about what survival requires. You thought it was money and breeding and city education. It's actually knowledge of how things work when everything else fails. The words were not quite an argument, not quite a truce. They hung in the cold air between them, while Catherine pulled blankets tighter and Emma sat in her corner with arms wrapped around knees that barely had flesh to cover them. On the fourth day underground together, Michael returned with news that the snow was settling, temperature rising slightly perhaps to 10 above zero. Still deadly to exposure, still too cold for the house, but movement in the right direction. He also brought more food from the cellar, including items Emma had never been allowed to access during her 9 weeks of theft. Dried beef, preserved fruit, flour for bread if they had a way to bake it. The abundance felt obscene compared to the scarcity she had endured. Emma ate her portion and said nothing, but her eyes met Michael's across the candle flame and held until he looked away. Week 2 in shared quarters established patterns that felt like permanent arrangements. Michael above ground during daylight hours, doing what farm work could be done in extreme cold. Catherine and Emma below, occupying the same space with increasing ability to function without immediate hostility. Catherine asked questions carefully phrased about the shelter's construction. Emma answered with technical precision that left no room for emotional content. How had she sealed the trap door leather cord and a latch reversed from normal installation? How had she managed in absolute darkness? Counted steps, memorized distances, accepted that sight was optional for survival. How had she not gone mad? The question assumed she had not. Emma was not certain that assumption was correct. Catherine began helping with tasks, small contributions that acknowledged shared space required shared work. She organized the food storage, carefully tracking what remained and what was needed. She took responsibility for water, managing the jugs Michael brought down from the well. She even attempted to clean using rags and melted snow to wipe down the platform and walls, though cleaning dirt walls underground achieved little beyond making her feel useful. Emma watched these efforts with the dispassion of someone who had moved beyond the need for validation. Catherine's help was practical, nothing more. It did not erase the expulsion or justify the suffering or transform their relationship into anything resembling friendship. They were women sharing a hole in the ground because winter had eliminated alternatives. The confrontation came on the 10th night of shared occupation when Catherine finally asked the question Emma had been waiting for. What happens when spring comes? Michael was above securing the barn for night. The candle burned low between them, creating shadows that moved like living things across straw walls. Emma took her time answering, feeling the weight of the question and the layers beneath it. I don't know. We survive to spring first, then we figure out what comes next. But you can't go back to how it was. You can't just disappear again. No, I can't. And I won't. Catherine's face worked through expressions Emma could barely read in the dim light. Shame, certainly. Understanding, maybe. But also calculation, the practical mind that had organized a kitchen, now organizing a future. You should have your own space. A cabin. Separate. With what money this farm barely supports 2 people. Michael will find a way. He owes you that much. Emma studied Catherine in the flickering light, seeing something she had not expected, an ally of convenience, perhaps, but an ally nonetheless. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a recognition that the old arrangement was dead and something new had to be built from its ruins. Michael descended the ladder, then ending the conversation before it could evolve further. He brought news of stars visible, wind died to nothing, temperature maybe rising toward 15 above. Progress measured in degrees so small they barely mattered, but might accumulate into something meaningful. The days blurred together after that, a routine of shared space and careful politeness and underlying tension that never quite broke into open conflict. Emma's body continued recovering, muscles rebuilding from protein she had been denied for weeks. Her face filled out slightly, bones becoming less prominent, though she would never return to the weight she had carried before the underground months. Catherine showed unexpected adaptability, learning to function in the cramped dark space with something approaching competence. She was not built for this life, would never choose it voluntarily, but she could survive it when survival was the only option. Emma granted her that much credit. Michael existed in a state of perpetual guilt that manifested as excessive helpfulness. He brought anything Emma requested without question. He deferred to her judgment on farm matters. He apologized with frequency that became annoying rather than meaningful. Emma eventually told him to stop. The apologies changed nothing and used air they could not spare. Week 3 brought the first hint of thaw. Temperature above ground reached 25 degrees, warm enough that snow began settling rather than accumulating. Michael reported seeing a cardinal, the first bird in weeks, a sign that weather was shifting towards something closer to survivable. Catherine surprised Emma by asking to be taught about the shelter's design, genuine curiosity, rather than polite interest driving the questions. Emma walked her through the principles, explaining thermal mass and insulation values and air exchange rates with the same precision she would use for a student. Knowledge was neutral. It could be shared without implying relationship beyond teacher and pupil. Could this be built elsewhere if someone needed to, with the right materials and enough time? The hardest part is finding or creating the void. Everything else is engineering. You could teach people, make this knowledge available. Maybe, if we survived a spring and if anyone cares to learn. The possibility hung between them, a future that implied Emma would remain visible rather than disappearing back underground or into someone else's household. Catherine did not press further, but the idea had been planted. Week 4 brought Michael's confession. They were all in the shelter, evening settling into night candle burning its last hour of useful light. He had been quiet all day, working above with unusual intensity, returning with a face that suggested internal arguments finally resolved. I knew about the void. Emma and Catherine both turned to him, the words not making immediate sense. Father showed me when I was 12, told me about the sinkhole, said it could be useful someday. I forgot, or I didn't forget exactly, I just dismissed it. Old man talking about old things that didn't matter. He looked at Emma directly for the first time in days. If I had remembered, if I had thought to look, I could have found you. Or found this space before you needed it. Instead, I walked over you for 9 weeks and never thought to wonder what the farm held that I didn't know. Catherine's shock was visible, even in candlelight. You knew this was here and didn't mention it when we were freezing. I didn't remember until Emma showed me. Then it came back, all of it, Father's voice explaining about earth temperature and shelter. I had the knowledge and lost it through not valuing it. Emma absorbed this confession with the same neutrality she applied to most revelations anymore. Anger required energy she had learned to conserve. Michael's failure to remember was just another item in a long list of failures that had brought them to this configuration. What you remembered or didn't remember changes nothing. I'm alive. You're alive. We're here. The past is whatever it is. But Catherine was not done processing, her voice rising with an edge Emma had not heard since the early days of her marriage. You could have told me about this space before winter, before I made Emma leave. We could have prepared it together, made it a real shelter, instead of forcing your sister to build it in secret. I didn't remember. How many times do I need to say it until it stops being an excuse for incompetence? The argument escalated, Michael and Catherine trading accusations that had nothing to do with the shelter, and everything to do with decisions made months ago. Emma listened with the detachment of someone watching a play, interested but not invested. Their marriage was their problem. She had enough of her own. Eventually, they exhausted themselves and fell into hostile silence. Emma added it to the list of tensions the shelter contained, one more pressure the walls had to hold. By week 5, late January, by Emma's best estimate, the temperature above ground had stabilized at a survivable range. Michael reported the road showed signs of traffic snow, packed by some traveler or group attempting passage. Help might reach them, or they might reach help within days rather than weeks. The question of what came next could not be avoided any longer. They were sitting in the shelter, all three, when Michael finally addressed it directly. The house can't be lived in until spring. Might not be livable then without significant repairs. So we stay down here until it is. Or we build something new, something better, using what Emma discovered. Emma's laugh was short and bitter. I didn't discover anything. I applied what I knew to a problem you created. Regardless this works, the house doesn't. That's information we can't ignore. Catherine spoke carefully, picking words like she was navigating ice. Emma should have a cabin, separate from the house, her own space. Michael nodded immediately, too quickly, as if he had been thinking the same and needed someone else to say it first. I'll build it. This spring, you design it, I build it. With what money? This farm barely supports 2 people, let alone 3+ construction. The farm will support what it needs to support. We'll make it work. Emma studied them both, seeing the guilt that motivated Michael and the complicated mixture of shame and pragmatism that drove Catherine. They were offering her space independence acknowledgement. It was less than she deserved and more than she had expected. Half the farm, legal ownership. Not just a cabin I live in, but land I own. Michael's face showed the calculation happening behind his eyes. The farm was his by inheritance and law. Splitting it meant giving up something he could keep if he chose. It also meant acknowledging a debt that could not be paid in buildings alone. Father left it to me. Father's dead. You nearly were. I saved your life with a shelter I built because you failed in your responsibility. Half the farmer I walk, and you explained to the county how you survived winter in a barn with a shelter underneath. The threat was empty, and they both knew it. Emma had nowhere to walk to, but the principle was sound, and Michael's guilt was real, and sometimes empty threats worked when backed by moral authority. I'll draw up papers. 50-50 ownership. You and me. Catherine's intake of breath was sharp. By the laws of the time, married women could not own property independently. Michael splitting the farm with his sister meant Catherine would own nothing despite being his wife. But Catherine, to her credit, did not object. She simply nodded, acknowledging a reality she had helped create. The agreement settled over them like snow cold and unchangeable. Emma would have land. Michael would have reduced inheritance. Catherine would have a husband whose respect for his sister now exceeded his deference to his wife. February arrived with a thaw that turned snow to slush and made the road passable for wagons. Help reached them on the 3rd, a neighbor checking on farms after the storm. Michael met them above ground, explained the situation in terms that omitted 9 weeks and emphasized 3 days. Emma climbed out of the shelter that day and stood in the barn, breathing air that felt warm at 20 degrees. She had been underground for 13 weeks, total 91 days, the exact span she had calculated in the beginning. Spring came slowly. Emma's cabin began construction in April, Michael building the frame while Emma supervised. The most important feature was not visible from outside a small root cellar beneath 4 feet by 6 feet, accessible through a trap door in the floor. The legal papers arrived in May. The farm was split, 50-50 each name on the deed with equal weight. Emma signed and felt the permanence of ink on paper. She never married. She became known across the county as the woman who had beaten winter underground. Neighbors asked questions. She taught them about earth-sheltered building. 3 families built root cellars using her designs that summer. By fall, the number had grown to 7. She was paid for her knowledge. $5 for a consultation, $10 for a detailed plan. The money went into a tin box beneath her cabin floor savings that gave her options beyond the farm. 5 years passed. Emma was 24, owner of significant land. The shelter remained beneath the barn unchanged except for gradual decay. She checked it occasionally, ensuring the structure was sound. A young woman arrived one afternoon in March of 1895, brought by her father who wanted to see the famous shelter. Emma led them to the barn, opened the trap door. The girl descended with fearless curiosity. "Were you scared?" "Every single day, but fear of dying was smaller than fear of living on someone else's terms." They climbed back up. The father paid her $10 and left. Emma stood in the barn after they departed, looking down at the opening that had been her grave and her salvation. She closed the trap door. The junk scattered. The floor looked ordinary again. Walking back to her cabin, she passed Michael and Catherine's house where they lived with 2 children now. Catherine waved. Emma waved back. They had achieved something that was not friendship, but was not hostility either. The cabin Emma had designed stood solid. The root cellar beneath held food for months. She entered and closed the door. She made coffee and sat at the table she had built herself in the house she had earned on the land that was legally half hers. The tin box beneath the floor held $230. Both leaving and staying were options. Through the window, the farm spread out in familiar patterns. And beneath the barn, invisible to anyone who did not know to look, a shelter waited in darkness. Emma had not forgiven them because memory was what kept her alive. But she had moved past revenge into independence. She did not need anyone's permission to exist. The earth had kept her secret for 91 days. In return, she had learned that some battles were won by going deeper rather than standing firm. She finished her coffee and prepared for the day's work. The farm would continue. Winter would return, and beneath the barn, the shelter would wait ready for anyone desperate enough to descend and disciplined enough to endure. Emma Hartwell had descended into darkness not as victim, but as architect of her own survival, and she had emerged with knowledge that could not be taken from her, that the earth does not judge, it only holds. And sometimes being held is enough.